Hey, this is Jay Kapoor.
Hey, this is Tim Katt.
Welcome to The Game Plan.
All right, Jay, great episode with Haley Rosen, former professional soccer player and founder of Just Women's Sports. We covered a lot, including the coverage of women's sports, media as an investment, and sports as a beachhead. I also want to talk to you about the latest M&A news in fitness tech. Let's get right into it. According to a report Haley cited, only 4% of sports coverage is dedicated to women's sports. Women's sports coverage, media problem or fan interest problem?
Tim, it's definitely not a fan interest problem. Look, we just saw last week with the release of the NWSL's data that their season, the first game, had over 500,000 viewers, 570,000 viewers. That compared to the most watched MLS game from last year, which had about 400,000 viewers. I mean, there is a massive amount of interest. And now you might say, okay, well, this is because of coronavirus and people have pent up interest in sports. Well, the Women's World Cup in 2019 had 1.12 billion viewers. So clearly it's not a viewership problem. Look, I think the problem is the decision makers at the top in sports are traditionally older, traditionally white men. And the decision making at that doesn't reflect a new generation of sports fans that want to see their favorite female sports stars who are awesome, who are playing at the highest level on the biggest stage. And so I think that needs to change.
Yeah, I think my favorite thing about what Haley had to say was that she's not starting Just Women's Sports as some justice issue or equality issue or some do-good thing, but she's doing it because female athletes are incredible and the things they do on the field are amazing. And the numbers you just cited show that exactly, right? And so it's definitely a coverage problem. It goes beyond that. Sports has a fundamental I should say systematic problem just in the fact that it is run by primarily old white men. And so that's who's going to cover it. I'm excited to see what she does with Just Women's Sports. And I think that even though starting a media company during a global pandemic sounds like a crazy thing to do when sports are all on pause, she's already started to show some amazing insight and been able to tell some great stories. For example, what's going on with the NWSL and what a success that's already been.
Yeah, I'm excited to see what happens with Just Women's Sports. But I think it segues into our next topic, which is that a lot of VCs have written off media as an investable category. Tim, you and I have both worked in media. You've definitely had more success investing in it than I have. I want to give you the first shot at this one. Media, is it venture backable or a broken business model?
Well, I love this topic. Listen, as somebody who was a part of Vice Media when it was a $5.7 billion valuation, and has invested in a couple media companies, a couple media tech companies, I can honestly say that it depends. Okay. I think that I like the fact that maybe investors have pulled back from media. I still think there's a massive opportunity there when you start to tie in more than just content, but everything from commerce, being able to port your community and get them behind things like events. Obviously, that's a little tricky right now due to the COVID pandemic, but look at a company like Barstool, regardless of what you think of their content or their ethics or whatnot, they've shown that media can still be a successful asset to invest in.
Yeah, and I think the question maybe is that ad-supported media is probably a bad venture-backable business model. When you've got Google and Facebook as this duopoly sucking all the oxygen out of the room.
That's right.
Yeah, it probably doesn't make sense for VCs to get involved in that. But subscription media is thriving, whether in sports with The Athletic or in other categories. You start to think about content and commerce making a resurgence. I think about Glossier and the brand Into the Gloss, which built an audience of 7 million dedicated women that wanted to try everything that Glossier put out. So there's a lot of different ways that you can actually make media work. It just doesn't mean that ad-supported media is the only way that media is investable. A lot of VCs are gun shy because they all went gung-ho on ad-supported media. Some of those, companies even had major acquisitions or major investments, and it just didn't pan out. But that doesn't mean that media is dead.
Now, Haley began her corporate career for Striver, a VR training company that got its start in sports. Question for you, sports as a beachhead for other lines of business. Is it a sound strategy or is it just a pipe dream?
No, I think it's a sound strategy, but I think it has to be communicated up front. So the problem is when a early stage founder comes in and pitches a VC and says, I'm building XYZ business to cater to professional sports. Well, okay, we know the size of that market. There's 120 professional teams. There's maybe 200 college teams that can actually afford to pay. Even if you're selling $500,000 in ACV, and that's just not venture scale. But if you come in there and communicate and say, professional sports is a great way for us to get the right exposure, and then we've got these 3 categories that we think are adjacent: entertainment, education, whatever it is, you have to communicate that up front, because that VC, that investor, needs to know that the TAM is large enough.
Yeah, I agree. And not just from an investor standpoint, but also just internally, whether it's as an executive team or as a company, what are we setting our sights on? I think it's so easy for companies that start in the sports space to get caught up in this logo trance. Oh, I'm talking to so-and-so from this NFL team or another person from a league office. And you start to go down this path where you don't remember what it is and why it is you're talking to them. Right. And that's the reality of sports. We're all fans. That's why, there's a lot of excitement. There's a lot of passion. And so the idea and the dream of having your favorite childhood team be a client of yours is really enticing. But if you can be focused from the start and say, here's what we're trying to get out of this, are we willing to, for example, do a sweetheart deal where we can use them from a marketing standpoint or have access to their fans somehow in some sort of activation we're doing? Like, what are we really talking about? Let's set the terms up front. Are you the type of team that is willing to pay for a service like this? Or is this just going to be an in-kind type deal where we can leverage your brand and you can leverage our services?
And Tim, we've seen that sports tech isn't just about what's on the field. Because in the last month, we've seen in the world of M&A and fitness tech, first Lululemon announced a $500 million acquisition of Mirror. And then we just saw a leak that Under Armour is looking to sell MyFitnessPal, which they acquired for $475 million back in 2015. So Tim, what the heck is going on?
Yeah, look, I'm really excited to talk about this. I want to focus in on MyFitnessPal because I'm a user of their product. And, you mentioned the high bar that's set with how much the acquisition was in 2015. But you've got to consider this business is doing roughly $6.5 million in recurring revenue every month. They've got 40 to 50 million active users and 150 million user database. So there's some really interesting things you could do from a brand perspective, from a UX perspective, and even from just like a subscription and pricing model standpoint where you charge everyone $1 a month instead of $30 a month, and suddenly you've got $1 billion plus ARR business.
Yeah, I think the one thing to consider here is that in these acquisitions, Mirror is not coming into a track record of an industry that has done well with these acquisitions. Under Armour being a prime example, having spent close to $700 million, and then realizing that Connected Fitness only made up about 3% of their revenue last year. The one thing I think Lulu could do with the acquisition of Mirror is use it as a true omni-channel opportunity. You've now got this very expensive giant iPad sitting in somebody's house, and you can use it to directly show them new Lulu products, have them try it on, create a true direct-to-consumer relationship once they've got that product in there. The one challenge is that they've only sold about 10,000 mirrors roughly compared to something like Peloton, which has close to 1 million active users. So the important thing here is going to be whether Mirror can continue selling that product, and if Lulu can then turn that opportunity into something omni-channel for this acquisition to make sense.
I think that's a great point, Jay. There's no one I'd rather chat $1,000 pieces of glass with than you. So thanks for joining me on this week's Partner Rundown.